Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! Hi. This happened a few years back in China. It's one of the universities there. Here, I was studying Chinese language and I shared my language class with some people from France and Belgium, the French-speaking part. Our Chinese teacher was a really nice little lady that happened to also speak French. So often whenever the French speaker had a question, they would ask it in French. Now, I didn't really mind it that much, but at some point, it got to the point where about half the questions in a class were asked in a language that I did not understand. Obviously, that is detrimental to my own learning experience since understanding the questions is important for me to learn the language. So I politely asked them if we could just do the class in English because about half of us didn't understand what was being asked. Lao Shi, the teacher, was very nice about it and afterwards asked the students if they could rephrase their question in English when they asked it in French. But apparently the French and Belgian girls and guys didn't take it so well. They were constantly glaring at me and whispering among themselves in French. Well, I just shrugged and moved on. However, outside of class they were always sticking together in their own little group, doing things together. At first they would just walk past me when I was sitting down having a beer with my friends, and they would simply glare. But at some point it came down to them cursing, talking bad about me to other students and spitting on my lap when I was sitting in a park. Obviously I was seizing, so I might have called them a few words, which were a bit too unsavory. Anyhow, they didn't take it well. So the next day I found out that they scribbled all sorts of things on my dorm room. It basically said, "Screw you." And they also wrote, "Nazi." I don't actually know why they put this one. I think they thought I was German or something, which I'm not. Obviously, I was angry, but I didn't really know what to do, so I reported it to the International Student Office. The office was really nice and understanding, but told me that they can't actually do much unless I provide proof that something is happening. Thus, I went on Taobao and bought a little recording camera. Looked a bit like a dashcam, it had the time and date and everything. After the university had painted my room door over, they couldn't get the markers off apparently. I hung the camera up in a corner of our dorm corridor and pointed it at my door. Then I left and made sure to loop around a little bit to walk past a group of French/Belgians so that they knew I was leaving campus towards the metro station. I had some nice dumpling soup and a beer, and when I came back, look and behold. Once again, they were hardly creative with their insults, just more of the same. But this time, I had proof. I checked the video and I was very pleased. 5 out of 7 of the group were actually there, and all wrote down something on the door with a permanent marker. One of the guys even kicked the door, which caused a crack at the bottom. These doors were not very sturdy. They seemed to have a lot of fun doing it though. Now, of course the school was properly pissed, especially when I showed them the video. Normally the students would just get a stern warning, but because this office was aware that they were doing it before, and also about the fact that they were harassing me all the time, I reported everything to them when it happened. They were less than understanding this time and suggested the board that had to decide on this. No idea what their name was, I couldn't recognize their name in Hangzhou. So yeah, they suggested to expel the students. And so they were. All of this took place over the course of a couple of months. So we were nearing the end of the semester. The 5 students who scribbled at my door got expelled just before their exams, which meant that all the time they spent at the university was effectively worthless since they did not receive any credits for it. But it gets even better. After this whole ordeal, I sent a neat/anonymous letter in Chinese. One of my Chinese friends helped me write it to the Public Security Bureau that these students had engaged in vandalism at our university. A few weeks later, after I already returned home, I was told by a friend of mine who was on good terms with their group that some of them had booked tickets and hostels to travel in China at the time of the semester. However, their visa extension was denied by the Public Security Bureau on the basis of their demeanor at the university. I'm not sure if the second part was caused because of my letter or simply because the university informed the police, but I like to pretend it was a former. So I was just laughing as they wasted half a year in courses for which they would receive no credit, and had to cancel thousands worth of travel plans. That truly was a sweet, sweet feeling. Edit. I have to say that the other French and Belgians I met in China were very pleasant people. It was just this group which was really awful. As an employee of a relatively fancy clothing store, it was just another day on the job until a woman in her 40s, Karen, and her kid who looked to be around 11 years old, walked in. They seemed like any other shoppers at first, browsing the racks and trying on clothes. But as they headed towards the fitting room, something seemed off. They were taking a suspiciously large amount of items with them. They had around 10 high-end designer clothes, a few accessories and bags. I noticed that they were trying to sneak some of them in their bags, and that's when I got suspicious. I decided to keep an eye on them, and sure enough, after a few minutes, they emerged from the fitting room empty-handed. They were trying to act casual, but I could see the guilt written all over the kid's face. They headed towards the exit, and that's when I knew something was definitely wrong. I quickly alerted security, and we confronted them just as they were about to leave the store. The security guard asked them to stop and wait for a moment, but they looked nervous and unsure. They kept glancing towards the door, and I knew they were trying to make a run for it. I could see the security guard was also suspicious, and he asked them to open their bags for inspection. They refused, and that's when the security guard knew for sure that something was amiss. "Excuse me, ma'am, but if you don't comply with our request, we're going to have to call the police," said the security guard. But Karen panicked, and in an attempt to escape decided to ditch her boy and run for the door. But she was quickly tackled to the ground by a security guard. The security guard was holding her by her arms, but she was struggling and trying to get free. She was screaming and shouting, "Let me go! I know my rights!" As the guard thought that he had detained her, she suddenly pulled out the pepper spray and sprayed him in the face. The security guard was momentarily blinded and in pain, but his partner was quick to react. He tackled her to the ground and disarmed her of the pepper spray before she could fully recover. The security guard was able to radio for backup and call the police. "You can't do this to me! I know my rights! I demand to speak to my lawyer!" shouted Karen as she was being handcuffed. The police arrived on the scene and she was arrested for theft and assault. They also found out that she had been shoplifting from multiple stores in the area and had a history of criminal behavior. The security guard was treated for pepper spray exposure but thankfully was not seriously injured. He was checked by the paramedics at the scene and cleared after a while. The other store employees were also shaken by the incident, but they were also relieved that no one was seriously injured. It was a shocking and violent incident, but it was a reminder that theft and assault are serious crimes and that there are consequences for such actions. The store decided to press charges, and Karen was facing a hefty fine and possibly jail time. I grew up on a country road with 4 houses. Our mailboxes were on the main road. Someone kept vandalizing the 4 boxes by driving through them, breaking the posts. I recall replacing the mailboxes a few times on weekends. After 4 to 5 times, my dad and the neighbors hatched a plan. My dad told me to get to bed early as we have a lot of work to do in the morning. After breakfast, we go to the mailbox and there are the other 3 neighbors and their sons. Along with a tractor with a post hole digger, railroad ties, cement, and a mini mixer. We proceed to dig 2 very deep holes. Digging holes is very backbreaking where I lived, as the land was a very rocky region. You only dug about 6 inches before we had to dig out a bunch of rocks in the hole. We took turns digging out the rocks over the entire morning. There was a lot of motivation as this was the last time we were going to fix the mailboxes. We dig 2 holes 6 feet deep and hoist 2 uncut 12-foot railroad ties in each hole. We then proceed to fill the top of each hole with cement. We added a cross beam and attached our new mailboxes. After an entire day of digging holes and pouring concrete, we all sat back and enjoyed our handiwork. A month goes by, and the kids and I walk to the mailbox to meet the boss. We discover what happens when a moving car meets an unmovable object. There is an old blue Buick Century with a smashed-up grille and bent wheel, and nobody in the car. This was well before cell phones, so we ran to the closest house and told the mom what we saw. We got back to the main road and get on the bus with the car still there. We find out later the highway ticketed the driver, a 14-year-old kid, and towed the vehicle. Now where I grew up, you could get a daytime driver's license at 14. One catch, if you receive 2 violations over 2 years, you lose your license until you turn 16 years old. The kid was ticketed for speeding a week prior. Oops, he now lost his license for 1.5 years. Insurance found out about the vandalism and refused to pay the claim. Then put the insurance plan in a high-risk category even when the kid couldn't drive. The kids that tried to fight it by saying the mailboxes were not legally built. Turns out mailbox construction is set by the state and county, and our state and county did not have any regulations on county mailboxes. I smile every time I go home. After 30 years, the indestructible mailboxes are still standing. This is a story I've been sitting on for a few years now. And having discovered this a couple months ago, I decided it's finally time to let the world know what happened to a sociopath who dared to cross a neighborhood. To set the stage, I used to live in a big but not huge city. Let's call it Bombville. I lived near the corner of a dense suburb nestled between overstuffed apartment buildings, a river that smelled like diesel when at low tide, and 2 busy highways. I was a minority in this neighborhood and I got a lot of heat for it. People did not really like white people there, but enough of our neighbors were accepting of us that aside from a few disagreements between families and the beatings that came with them, I didn't feel like I was in danger when leaving my home. It was a rough neighborhood, but it was my home, and it protected its own. The community center was like a temple, and this woman, let's call her AM, was a priestess in our neighborhood. She was respected very much, and her calm and understanding reflected her status. I never once saw her behave without a strong moral code. And the final piece to set the stage, our former landlord. Short Asian lady in all the stereotypical ways, kind and sweet. Our house was above my parents' pay grade and she knew it. She went out of her way to find house repair and maintenance jobs for tenants that were having money problems. She'd pay them by taking chunks out of their rent, oftentimes a bit larger than how much the work they did was worth. Looking back, that was probably illegal, but that's irrelevant because, well, she died. The circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious, but none of the suspects play a part in this story, so there is no need to go into detail on it. Her sons, who wanted nothing to do with real estate, took over the business. They couldn't make heads or tails of how she managed to float books with so many read on them and began dumping properties. Ours was on that list. I harbor no ill will towards them and still wish them the best, but the guy who bought the house entered the sociopath and today's victim. This guy wasted no time in making our lives hell. His first action was to raise the rent. Apparently, when the account changed hands, he was allowed to update the rent to modern pricing. We've been there for several years and were paying below market even from the onset. So this was a huge blow by itself. The second blow came when he said that the rent had to be ready, in full, on the 1st of every month. No partial payments, no work to reduce it, no extensions. For rent on the 1st of the month or an eviction notice on the 2nd. This was hemorrhaging our savings, but we were surviving for the moment. Meanwhile, AM had lobbied hard for the city to co-fund a revival project to renovate the entire aging suburb, and she succeeded. One street at a time had a conga lines of work trucks almost every day, and people were getting old leaky pipes replaced, sinkholes in yards patched, fences repaired, paint renewed. It was an amazing thing and an enticing thing for the sociopaths. Being at the corner of the neighborhood, our house was on the last street on the list, and sociopaths wanted us out so he could relist the house after renovation. He never said this directly, but multiple conversations made his intent clear even for a 10-year-old me. Random inspections, overhyping of minor problems with the house, even so far as trying to bring us up on completely false animal abuse charges because our cat was attacked by what we believe was a raccoon and he tried to claim we did it. Yeah, because of it, can't figure out the difference between knife wounds and a mauling. We read the writing on the wall and began preparations to move. We decided to move in with my oldest brother in a place I will call Banjoland. Most of us had moved except my other brother, who stayed behind because he still had a lot of social ties in Palmville. And his new job meant if he cut corners, he could keep paying the sociopath's inflated bills. Well, despite his best efforts, he came up $20 short 1 month, and the sociopath jumped on it. He had 30 days. We made the 400-mile trip from Banjoland to Palmville to get the rest of our stuff, and I can't say as I approved of my brother's living conditions, but I guess that's beside the point. The months passed rather uneventfully. I guess the sociopath figured he'd won, so there was no need to burn the gas to drive out and gloat. The neighborhood had learned what was going on, and that was the first time I'd ever been back in that neighborhood, where I didn't get a single call-out, a single glare, a single racist remark. Everybody behaved reverently. It was kind of disturbing, in all honesty. I guess people in lower incomes all know what eviction means, and felt like I was having a bad enough time already. Well, 20 days later, he says it's time to leave. We still had a week left, but it didn't matter. We didn't have the money to try fighting it with a lawyer. AM was really nice and bought us a couple of extra days, but it was evident he really wanted us out. Possibly because the work trucks were now 1 street away. The last time I ever saw the house I grew up in, workmen were throwing my childhood possessions into a large bin when we supposedly still had 3 days left to leave. Everything that follows is a collection of information I got through the grapevine and phone calls with people present at the events. Immediately, sociopath moved into the house himself. People who owned the homes they were living in were getting the full cost of renovations comped by the city. He figured that by moving in himself, he'd be able to get his house he bought at liquidation price renovated for free and flip it. But AM was having none of it. She explained to him that at the time the revival project was approved, that house was a rental lot, and they can't change the budget now. She then explained to him that the partial cost coverage that had been approved for the lot was in our name, not his, and he wasn't eligible for partial cost comping either. He'd have to pay every penny himself, and since the entire neighborhood was getting a facelift, he was required to at least renovate the exterior. Otherwise, she'd see the house condemned as an eyesore or dilapidated or whatever the legal term is. He went really cheap on the renovations, basically putting in new carpets and a coat of paint. This would later come to bite him back. He then began trying to sell the house in earnest. The neighborhood remembered what he'd done. There were vandalisms when nobody was there, and loud noises from the neighbors when people were there to look the house over. And anytime a prospective buyer asked around, they got the full stink eye from anybody they talked to. They made sure he simply couldn't get that house sold at market value. After 3 months of this, he lowered the listing price. Then a month later, he lowered it again, and finally got a bite. AM personally made sure he had to file every single piece of paperwork before it changed hands. Every single part of the house had to be inspected thoroughly. And that's when he got what he deserves. In his nasty and cheap renovations, he somehow damaged the pipes. Black mold. AM remembered how he treated us and she decided to pay him back in kind. I never heard how exactly she pulled it off, but she managed to delay him getting the news about the black mold being discovered for several days, long enough that by the time he did get the news, he didn't have enough time left to try getting it cleaned or make a last-ditch effort to save the house. The house was condemned days later. In their final act, AM members of the neighborhood filed every single complaint, an injunction they could, and arranged for him to be compelled by the city to demolish the house immediately, a cost he had to pay out of his own pocket. He tried to destroy a family in pro-class just to make some quick cash, and instead was left fighting a year-long legal battle and ended up losing thousands. The neighborhood remembers, the neighborhood punishes. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.